Hans. We have Hans Auer, and the presentation is Resource Adequacy with Increasing Share of Wind and Solar Power, a comparison of European and US electricity market designs.
Okay. So thank you. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to present now a joint work I've conducted with Odin from MIT. So we initiated this study during his stay a couple of years ago at our university in Vienna, at TU Wien. We raised the question, so how does the market designs in the US and Europe fit to maintain resource adequacy in the short and long term? Because we are facing the challenge of increasing shares of wind and solar PV generation. And therefore we raised the question, how could this fit and depend also on the market designs? So the key questions have been, how does wind and PV impact electricity prices in the short and long term in general? What are the drivers for wholesale price market decreases? Are wind and PV responsible, or are these the only drivers, or are they not responsible? And then we raised the question, okay, what's the impact of the market designs? What are the pros and the cons of the different market designs for hosting high shares of PV and wind generation, always against the background to maintain somehow resource adequacy? And then towards the end of our study, of course, we need to come up with recommendations and what are possible improvements in the market design, trying to minimize, let's say, market intervention. So first we had a look on the electricity and natural gas prices on the wholesale marketplaces. On the left-hand side we see Europe, and on the right-hand side we see the US. So here we present the annual average prices on the different marketplaces. So in Europe we see, let's say, the most important marketplaces. On the upper end, there are markets like Italy operating a high share of CCGT power plants. On the lower end, rather markets like the Nordic market with high shares of hydropower. So there is quite a colorful picture in Europe, and the blue dashed line shows the natural gas price. And here we see in the last couple of years, starting in 2011-12, quite a decoupling on the one hand of natural gas price development compared to the wholesale markets. On the contrary to the US. So here we see the main wholesale marketplaces in the US. And a snapshot here, when matching it with the wholesale gas prices, there can't be observed any obvious deviation in terms of the different patterns. So then we had a detailed look, so I show this slide first, on the different studies. So we have not conducted in-depth analysis, but because there has been done a lot of work in this respect. So in terms of the drivers of electricity price decreases in Europe and the US, again on the left-hand side, we see a summary of the main studies, and in Europe a merit order effect was identified. It was between 5 and 13 euros per megawatt hour in the different studies, and it was significant that the variable renewables, wind and PV, have been one of the main drivers for these wholesale price decreases. On the contrary to the US. In the US, so here we see one example in California. that the variable renewables only contribute to a small extent to the overall price decreases, and it still has been the gas price being responsible for setting the wholesale price levels. We have observed in both markets, in Europe and the US, in addition to that, negative prices in the recent years occasionally. So what are we talking about? So what are the shares of wind and PV and also other renewable penetrations in Europe and the US? So on the left-hand side, again, we see Europe, and we see the main support schemes in 2017. So in Europe, we switched in the last couple of years from initially rather pure subsidies, so pure feed-in tariffs. We had in a few countries quota-based certificate schemes, but now we switched in the last couple of years mainly to auction-based systems. So if those who win the auction mainly are rewarded in many of these countries with either a feed-in tariff, but increasingly with a premium tariff. This means that the residual to be able to fully cover your cost is still subsidized. But finally, you have to at least be aligned with the wholesale markets. So this has driven the share of renewables up to around 30% in the electricity generation portfolio in Europe in 2017. In the US, we are talking around 15%, around half of renewable electricity generation, and predominantly, no, it's the wrong direction. Predominantly, we are talking about renewable portfolio standards with or without mandatory net metering systems. So in some countries there are also voluntary metering systems, and some countries rely on renewable portfolio goals only. So in both markets, again, in Europe and the US, in addition, increasingly also other volunteer approaches are implemented, so energy communities, PV sharing concepts, and all these kind of recent developments. So now we raise the question on the one hand, how does short-term electricity market operation work in either of these two electricity markets, and what are on the one hand the pros and on the other hand the cons in terms of market compatible integration of wind and PV generation. So one of the main differences between European and US short-term electricity market operation is that the US market was built into the existing system operation. So the role of the independent system operator is very important, and the system in the US emphasizes the physics of the power system. On the contrary, so in Europe, we decoupled a little bit the physics of operating the power system, and we implemented new power exchanges. So we implemented these market places, clearing our wholesale markets and also other ones, also shorter-term markets. And at present, we are facing a little bit problems in this respect, because we also have zonal pricing system, and now we increasingly try to couple this market, implement flow-based coupling mechanisms in order to reflect at least to some extent the physics of the load flow of electricity. On the contrary, the US has a nodal pricing system with clear locational marginal prices on each node. There is a significant difference also in terms of reserve markets. So we have, let's say, a much more decoupled reserve market, a sequential reserve and energy market compared to the US, where you have a co-optimization of energy and operation reserves. and also balancing in our markets is decentralized, and the role of the balance responsible parties is much more emphasized than in the US, where you have more centralized control through the ISO. And another significant difference is that in the US you have dispatchable renewables, and in Europe in the past we had priority dispatch of subsidized wind and PV, so it was a must-take generation, and therefore, of course, this was a significant market intervention and a disadvantage for conventional generators. So here we see that because finally, a conventional generator, here I show the average and the marginal cost on the one hand, so in orange of a CCGT power plant, and in blue of a nuclear power plant, so of a baseload technology. So the cost over the quantities, annual generation, or the full load hours. And the more renewables you implement into the system, the more you decouple the average cost from the marginal cost from any kind of technology, and the more challenging it is to earn sufficient revenues in the market, because at the end of the day each technology needs to earn at least the average cost, and this is actually the critical point. So how finally to earn sufficient revenues to fill this gap between the average and the marginal cost. And this has led in both markets, not only in Europe, but also in the US, to the question of long-term resource adequacy and different kind of capacity mechanisms. So in case you are not able to fill the gap between the average cost and the marginal cost, and if it's not possible, if you have an energy-only market, you rely on that it works appropriately. Because an energy-only market, then it needs to be possible that you send out the correct price signals. It must be, or you must be able to earn scarcity rents, that you can offer corresponding price bids in the energy market, and that you also exploit several kind of flexibilities in this market. If this is not possible, then different capacity mechanisms in general, they are possible. They are also discussed and we'll see also implemented in many countries in both marketplaces. So you have different kind of capacity mechanisms you could implement. On the one hand, quantity-based approaches. On the contrary, price-based approaches. So quantity-based are strategic reserves, capacity obligation, capacity markets. A price-based mechanism is a capacity payment. So for instance, in a capacity payment, so you might solve the revenue problem in a system for the individual generators, but at the end of the day, you are not sure if you solve the physical problem, if you have the appropriate amount of capacities in the system. On the contrary to a capacity market. So here you can, let's say, be sure more or less that you are auctioning the corresponding amount of capacities, but on the other hand, you are not sure if the generators finally will earn sufficient revenues in the market. And also these two approaches, they need high market intervention, and for instance, strategic reserves, they do not solve the medium to long-term capacity problem, that they rather are qualified to prevent existing power plants to retire from the market. So it's only a temporary solution. So maybe in between a price quantity-based mechanism, this capacity subscription could also be an additional aspect. I'll elaborate a little bit more afterwards, after showing the status quo, what's implemented right now, because capacity subscriptions are not seriously taken into account at present, neither in Europe nor in the US. So in Europe, we have implemented several of the remaining ones. The green colors, these countries show that they still rely on an energy-only market. Then we have a capacity market in UK. We have capacity obligations, this rather a decentralized approach in France. And then capacity payments in the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, Greece, Ireland, and also some Baltic countries. We also have, except capacity payments, several others in the US. So Texas ERCOT relies on an energy-only market. So here in the northeast and also in the south, we have capacity markets. Others also, sorry, okay. It's this way. Others also rely on capacity obligations. So one of the problems is if you have between two marketplaces or between two countries. So for instance, you have on the one hand an energy-only market, and in another marketplace you have some kind of capacity mechanisms. You have distortions in the short and long term, which intervenes finally and sends the wrong price signals, and therefore it's ambiguous if you do not rely on a wider market area on a similar instrument. And what's missing a little bit in this portfolio of mechanisms is that the demand side, the consumer preference, so here it is not taken into account. So, and in case you want to include or to better include also the demand side, the idea could be that finally during scarcity situations, the consumer also can decide in terms of the priority they want to be served. And based on that, then generators and storage is compensated. So this would be the idea that this capacity subscription finally directly moves to a private good, so in an economically efficient way, and the capacity price finally reflects the consumer's preferences. But of course, it's rather difficult to implement, or the challenge is to control the load at the consumer level and the corresponding, let's say, cost and the devices to implement this. But this also shall be seriously considered in order to better reflect also demand-side participation in case it is needed. So in our research, finally, we come up with some general recommendations and then some specific recommendations, on the one hand for the European market and on the other hand for the US market. So the general recommendations, they are true for both of them. I'd like just to highlight a few of them, not go through the entire list. There's several bullet points there. But what's really important is we shall not further distort our markets. So we shall remove gradually the technology-specific subsidies of several renewables. And then we'll see where we are clearing our markets in the short and long term. We'll see if we have adequate pricing of carbon and other externalities. If this is taken into account and the wholesale market prices reflect also these externalities, we'll also see at which levels we clear our wholesale markets. And also in the short term, so there is an improvement in terms of price formation, so in the energy and reserve markets, and particularly during scarcity hours. So at present in both markets, there is some kind of ceiling implemented. So this, of course, is not necessarily an advantage to send out, let's say, that the right price signals, and in the medium to long term, of course, also the corresponding investment signals for new power plant investments. And then, of course, it's important that you incentivize the implementation and provision of several flexibilities and also the several decentralized options and storages. So just a few general remarks. So when coming to the specific recommendations, I'd like also to highlight only a few items here. So in Europe, it's definitely important to better represent. Okay, so only half a minute, so then I'm finished. Yeah, it's definitely important to have an improved representation of the transmission in the market clearing. We have to implement higher resolution in the real-time dispatch and market clearing, and we need to consider economic dispatch of renewables. On the other hand, in the US, so it's recommended that we focus a little bit more on the long-term contracts, and also what could be learned rather from Europe is the implementation of intraday markets for market-based balancing, and maybe also opening up retail competition in a larger part compared to the status quo. And this, or here I come to the conclusion. So this is to some extent a repetition what I already said. So our observation is that there is no single solution. So lessons can be learned in both directions. So there are a few items which might be more elegant in Europe, but even more elegant design options are implemented in the US. So here we in Europe can learn from the US. So this is our observation. Thank you.
Very nice comparison for market. This is exactly the question one of the readers asked for. But I have an interesting, you had a last question about retail competition. We flipped the last one there. So what is your, could you tell more why you think in the US we need a large part of retail competition? So far it doesn't have any evidence saying there's efficiency gain in the retail part of the business.
Yeah, it's simply to take into account also the second part of the equation, so supply is demand. So because in the past we had energy planning, integrated resource planning, and also in our kind of modeling, we always take demand simply as a constraint. So we exclude the demand side from contributing to the market, and the free choice of the supplier, the customer segmentation. So this shall be increasingly taken into account, and also offering them a variety of different, let's say, flexible tariff schemes and so on. So it's always argued that the retail companies, they take the risk or they hedge the risk for the end users, but not several of the end users have the same risk profile. So for instance, I would very much appreciate to purchase the wholesale market price as a private consumer, but I can't do so, even not in Europe or in Austria. So this is what is meant.
Magnus Førkås from University of Technology in Norway. So just a question about, you mentioned something about coordination or cooperation between TSOs to be improved for future markets. But can you say something more specifically about the benefits of creating common markets for instance, balancing across borders?
Yes. Yes, so in Europe, so we have historically grown structures and the different national TSOs you cannot simply, let's say, merge them and argue we now operate one European independent system operator. So this would be a political discussion. This is not possible in the short to medium term, or maybe not in the long term. But now in the short term, we are already cooperating. So we already allocate the cross-border capacities based on load flow analysis. We try to avoid counteracting activation of balances. So if one zone is short, the other one is long. So in the past, so in each zone, the system was balanced, and now we do this, we coordinate it already, meaning that the synergies we gain from the physics of system operation, we already implemented first, and then only the net result needs to be balanced. So these kind of coordination is already increasingly implemented, also in terms of redispatch. So we are already cooperating much more. So in that sense, we try, let's say, manually to implement some kind of, starting from the zonal price system, some kind of, let's say, bigger nodal priced system within these zones. So in terms of redispatch. So this could be a few examples besides others.
Very quick one. In your conclusion remark, you mentioned the big question is the success of the system depends on system operators. So what's your definition of system operators?
Yeah, system operators. So in the US, so I meant the ISO. So really operating the system, starting from frequency control to the different market segments. So from frequency control to intraday markets, day-ahead markets, and all the procedures behind. So the scheduling, the clearing, and several of these procedures. So this is. Yeah, and of course also the product definition, how you define your products. So how the bits need to be submitted, the characteristics of the bits and so on.